Welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for the best Reddit creepypasta stories, perfect for bedtime chills. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the story. Hey everyone, this is my first post here, and I'm really desperate for some advice. I've been going through something terrifying, and I don't know who else to turn to. I need help. And fast. So, a bit of background first. I've always been into spooky stuff, horror movies, haunted houses, all that. My friends know I'm the go-to guy for anything paranormal. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to have a game night and someone suggested we play with a Ouija board. I know, cliche, right? But I've done it a couple of times before and nothing ever happened. So I thought, why not? We set everything up in my living room. It was me, my girlfriend, Emily, and our 2 friends, Jake and Sarah. We lit some candles to set the mood and turned off the lights. The board was old and dusty, something I found in a thrift store years ago. We placed our fingers on the planchette and started asking the usual questions. Is anyone there? And, can you give us a sign? At first, nothing happened. We laughed it off, thinking it was just another boring session. But then, the planchette started moving. I swear, none of us were pushing it. It was gliding across the board, spelling out HELLO. We all froze. Jake tried to break the tension by making a joke, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We asked for a name, and it spelled out GRANDPA. My heart skipped a beat. Both my grandparents died in a car accident when I was 10. I hadn't thought about them in years. I asked, is this really you, Grandpa? The planchette moved to YES. Emily squeezed my hand, and I felt a chill run down my spine. We continued asking questions, and the responses we got were eerily accurate. Things only my grandparents would know. I should have stopped there, but curiosity got the better of me. Grandpa, are you and Grandma happy? I asked. The planchette spelled out NO. Why not? I asked, my voice shaking. BECAUSEWEAREINHELL. We all stared at each other in disbelief. My girlfriend started crying, and Jake tried to lighten the mood again, but his voice cracked. I wanted to stop, but something kept me going. What can we do to help you? I asked. LETUSIN. At that moment, the candles flickered, and the room got cold. Really cold. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Emily screamed and dropped the board. Jake tried to turn on the lights, but the switch wouldn't work. We were plunged into darkness, except for the flickering candlelight. Suddenly, we heard a loud bang from the basement. It sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. We all jumped up, our nerves frayed. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way downstairs. The others followed close behind. When we got to the basement door, it was wide open. Now I always keep it locked because the basement creeps me out. We shined the flashlight down the stairs, and that's when we saw it. At the bottom of the steps, there was a dark figure, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like a shadow, but it had eyes, glowing red eyes staring right at us. Emily screamed again, and we bolted back upstairs. We slammed the door shut and barricaded it with furniture. We were all panicking, not knowing what to do. Jake suggested we end the session properly, so we hurried back to the Ouija board. With shaking hands, we moved the planchette to goodbye. But as soon as we did, we heard a whisper. A cold, raspy voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You invited us in. The lights flickered back on, and everything seemed normal again. But we knew it wasn't. We could feel it. The atmosphere in the house had changed. It felt oppressive, like something was watching us. We decided to call it a night and leave. As we were gathering our things, I noticed something on the board. Scratched into the wood, almost imperceptibly, were the words, "Welcome home." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red, glowing eyes. Emily stayed over because she was too scared to go home. We lay in bed, clinging to each other, jumping at every little sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I thought it was one of my friends, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I checked on Jake and Sarah. They were both asleep. Then I saw it. A shadow at the end of the hall. The same one from the basement. It stood there unmoving, staring at me with those red eyes. I slammed the door shut and woke Emily up. We spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, lights on, clutching a baseball bat for protection. The shadow didn't come back, but the feeling of being watched never went away. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a group hallucination, or maybe someone was playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it was real. I knew we had invited something evil into my house, and I didn't know how to get rid of it. I'm writing this now because things have gotten worse, much worse, and I don't know how much longer we can hold on. If anyone has any advice or knows how to deal with this, please help us. I'm terrified, and I don't know what to do. After that night, Emily and I tried to resume normal life, but normal wasn't an option anymore. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, and the house felt colder. Even during the day, there was a damp chill in the air that no amount of heating could fix. It was like the warmth was being sucked out of the place. We decided to do some research about getting rid of spirits or demons, whatever it was we had summoned. Emily suggested getting a priest to bless the house, and at this point, I was willing to try anything. We contacted the local church, and Father Daniels agreed to come over. When he arrived, the air seemed to thicken. As he walked through the front door, he paused and looked around, his face growing pale. He asked us to sit in the living room while he performed the blessing. Emily and I clung to each other, listening to his murmured prayers and the occasional splash of holy water. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from upstairs. Father Daniels stopped and turned to us, his face grim. He asked if we had any religious artifacts in the house. I remembered an old crucifix my grandma had given me when I was a kid. It was in a box in the attic. I ran upstairs to get it. As I approached the attic door, I felt a rush of cold air. I hesitated, but I knew we needed that crucifix. I pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up. The moment I reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the attic into darkness. My flashlight flickered, and I heard a low growl coming from the corner of the attic. I swung the light around, trying to see what it was. There, in the shadows, I saw them. 2 figures, my grandparents, standing side by side, but their faces were twisted into grotesque, malevolent grins. Their eyes were black voids, and their mouths were filled with sharp, jagged teeth. They started moving toward me, slowly and deliberately. "Why did you leave us?" my grandmother's voice echoed, distorted and inhuman. "You invited us back. You promised." I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to find the crucifix. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep hold of it. Just as they were about to reach me, I found the box and yanked it open. The crucifix was there, tarnished but intact. I grabbed it and held it out in front of me. The figures recoiled, hissing and snarling. The attic door flew open, and I tumbled down the ladder, clutching the crucifix to my chest. I bolted down the stairs and nearly collided with Father Daniels. He took one look at me and nodded, understanding the urgency without needing words. He took the crucifix and continued the blessing, focusing especially on the attic. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and for the first time in days, we felt a glimmer of hope. But it was short-lived. That night, I woke up to the sound of Emily crying. I turned to her and saw that she was still asleep, but tears were streaming down her face. I gently shook her awake and she gasped, looking around in terror. "They were in my dreams," she whispered. "Your grandparents. They told me they were coming for us." We decided to stay awake for the rest of the night, sitting in the living room with every light in the house turned on. Around 3 a.m., the witching hour, the temperature plummeted. Our breath fogged in the air, and we heard footsteps coming from the hallway again. But this time, they were faster, more aggressive. I grabbed the crucifix and stood up, ready to confront whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped right outside the living room door. We stared at the door, waiting, hearts pounding. Suddenly, it burst open, and a gust of icy wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, we heard whispering, dozens of voices, overlapping and incomprehensible. Emily screamed, and I felt something cold and clammy grab my arm. I swung the crucifix blindly, and the whispers turned into screams. The lights flickered back on, and for a split second, I saw them again. My grandparents, twisted and evil, standing in the corner, watching us with those black voids for eyes. And then, they were gone. The room was silent again, but we knew it was far from over. We haven't slept properly in days. I've noticed dark shadows moving at the edge of my vision, and Emily's been having night terrors every night. I don't know how much more of this we can take. The crucifix helps, but it's not enough. We need something stronger, something permanent. I'm begging you, Reddit. If anyone knows how to get rid of evil spirits, please tell me. We're desperate, and I don't know how much longer we can hold on. Hey everyone, I'm back. Thanks for the advice and support. But things have gotten even worse. I'm running on fumes here, but I need to share what's been happening in case it can help someone else avoid this nightmare. After my last post, Emily and I decided we couldn't stay in the house anymore. The constant feeling of being watched, the shadows moving in the corners, the night terrors, it was too much. We packed some bags and went to stay with Jake and Sarah. They were more than understanding, given they had been there when this whole thing started. The first night at Jake and Sarah's was uneventful, which was a huge relief. We started to think maybe we'd left the evil behind, but we were wrong. So wrong. On the second night, around 2 a.m, Sarah woke up screaming. Jake and I rushed to their bedroom and found her sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror. She said she saw my grandparents standing at the foot of the bed, just staring at her. Jake tried to comfort her, saying it was just a bad dream, but I knew better. They had followed us. We tried to sleep with the lights on, but the next night it happened again. This time, Jake saw them too. He described them exactly as I had. Their faces twisted into grotesque grins, eyes like black voids. We knew we had to do something drastic. Emily suggested we visit a psychic. Desperate for answers, we found one in the next town over, a woman named Madame Serena. Her place was filled with the usual occult paraphernalia, crystals, incense, tarot cards. I wasn't sure if I believed in any of it, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. Madame Serena listened to our story without interruption, her face growing more serious with each passing minute. When we finished, she nodded and said we had indeed summoned something evil, and it was now bound to us. "There's a ritual," she said. "It's dangerous, but it might be your only hope. You need to sever the connection and banish these spirits back to where they came from." She gave us a list of items to gather: black candles, salt, sage, and something personal that belonged to my grandparents. The personal item was easy. I had an old locket of my grandmother's. The rest we managed to find at an occult shop. Madame Serena agreed to come to Jake and Sarah's house to perform the ritual. She set everything up in the living room, drawing a circle of salt on the floor and placing the candles at each cardinal point. We sat inside the circle, holding hands, with the locket in the center. As she began chanting, the temperature dropped again. The air grew thick and I felt a pressure in my chest, like something heavy was sitting on me. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The shadows began to move, swirling around us like a dark, malevolent fog. Madame Serena's voice grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into the forms of my grandparents, their faces even more twisted and grotesque than before. They lunged at the circle, but they couldn't cross the salt. They screamed, a sound so unearthly it made my blood run cold. The room shook, and I felt like my head was going to explode from the pressure. Emily clung to me, sobbing. Jake and Sarah were white with fear, their eyes fixed on the horrific apparitions. Madame Serena's chanting reached a fever pitch, and she threw the locket into the air. There was a blinding flash of light, and the figures of my grandparents were sucked into it, their screams echoing through the room. The light vanished, and the room fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we could breathe easily. Madame Serena looked exhausted, but she smiled weakly at us. "It's done. They're gone." We thanked her profusely, but but she warned us that we needed to be careful. The veil between worlds is thin. Never dabble in things you don't understand. You may not be so lucky next time. We thought it was over, that we could finally move on with our lives, but we were wrong. That night, Emily woke up screaming again. She said she felt something cold and clammy touch her leg. I checked, but there was nothing there. We tried to go back to sleep, but we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I found scratches on the walls, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. The shadows were back, lurking just out of sight, and the whispers. God, the whispers. They were louder, more insistent. It felt like they were right next to us, breathing down our necks. We realized we hadn't banished the spirits. We had only made them angrier. They were bound to us, and they weren't going to let go. I don't know how much longer we can hold out. We're all exhausted, terrified, and at our wits' end. Please, if anyone has any advice or knows someone who can help, let us know. We're desperate. I'll update you all as soon as I can. If we survive this. After the failed ritual with Madame Serena, we were at our breaking point. Sleep deprived, terrified, and feeling completely hopeless. We decided to get out of town. We packed our bags and drove to a cabin in the woods that Jake's family owns, hoping that putting some distance between us and the house might help. The first night at the cabin was peaceful. It felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off our shoulders. Emily and I managed to get a few hours of sleep, which felt like a miracle. But as the sun set on the second night, the sense of dread began to creep back in. It was subtle at first, a chill in the air, the feeling of being watched, but it quickly escalated. We were sitting around the fireplace, trying to keep our spirits up by telling funny stories from our childhoods. But then, the lights started flickering. The fire in the fireplace dimmed, and we were plunged into an eerie half-light. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and twist, forming unnatural shapes. Emily screamed as a shadow detached itself from the wall and moved toward us. I grabbed the crucifix from my bag and held it out, but the shadow didn't stop. It wrapped itself around Emily, lifting her off the ground. She thrashed and screamed, but it held her tight. I lunged forward, trying to pull her free, but it was like trying to fight smoke. Jake and Sarah were shouting, but their voices sounded distant, muffled. The shadow tightened its grip on Emily, and I saw her eyes roll back in her head. In a moment of sheer panic, I remembered something Madame Serena had said about the power of names. I shouted my grandparents' names, demanding they let her go. To my shock, the shadow dropped Emily. She fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The shadow recoiled, writhing and twisting, before dissipating into the air. We were left in stunned silence, the only sound Emily's ragged breathing. That night, we decided to take shifts staying awake. We couldn't risk another attack while we were all asleep. I took the first watch, sitting in the dark, with the crucifix in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard a scratching sound coming from the back door. It was slow, deliberate, like something with claws was trying to get in. I woke Jake and Sarah, and we armed ourselves with kitchen knives, though I doubted they'd do much good. As we approached the door, the scratching grew louder, more frantic. I could see the door bulging inward, as if something massive was pushing against it. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, and the door went still. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for whatever came next. Without warning, the door exploded inward, wood splintering everywhere. Standing in the doorway were my grandparents, but they were even more grotesque than before. Their skin was pale and rotting, eyes glowing red. They opened their mouths, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a bone-chilling scream. We ran. There was no other option. We bolted out of the cabin and into the woods, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from them. The forest was pitch black, and we stumbled over roots and rocks, desperate to escape. I could hear them behind us, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. Just when I thought we couldn't run any further, we burst into a clearing. In the center was an old, crumbling stone altar, covered in strange symbols. I remembered reading something about ancient rituals and decided to take a chance. We ran to the altar, and huddled together, hoping it would offer some protection. As my grandparents reached the edge of the clearing, they stopped. They seemed unable to cross the boundary into the clearing, hissing and snarling in frustration. It was like an invisible barrier was holding them back. They circled us, their red eyes never leaving us. We spent the rest of the night there, too scared to move. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the figures of my grandparents faded away, leaving us in a stunned, exhausted silence. We made our way back to the cabin, praying it was over, but it wasn't. The cabin was in ruins, the door shattered, and the inside trashed. We gathered our things and decided to head back to the house, hoping that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. On the drive back, we barely spoke. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We were being hunted by something evil, and it wasn't going to stop until it had us. I kept thinking about the altar in the clearing. There had to be some way to use it to our advantage, some way to banish my grandparents for good. When we got back to the house, we found a message scratched into the front door. "You can't escape us." It was a chilling reminder that no matter where we went, they would follow. We were running out of options and time. When we got back to the house, we were all on edge. Emily was shaking, Sarah was crying quietly, and Jake had a look of grim determination on his face. We knew we couldn't keep running. We had to confront whatever this was head on. Our only chance was to figure out how to use the altar we found in the woods. We did some research and discovered it was likely an ancient druidic site, a place of power used for rituals. We hoped that if we performed a banishment ritual there, we might be able to sever the connection to my grandparents once and for all. The problem was, none of us knew how to perform such a ritual. We decided to go back to Madame Serena for help. When we arrived at her place, she looked even more drained than before, but she agreed to help. She said we would need to gather specific ingredients, herbs, crystals, and a few drops of our own blood, and perform the ritual at midnight, the time when the veil between worlds is thinnest. We spent the rest of the day gathering the items. Every minute felt like an hour, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on us. As night fell, we made our way back to the clearing in the woods, the sense of dread growing with every step. When we reached the altar, Madame Serena began setting up, placing the herbs and crystals in a precise pattern around the stone. She instructed us to form a circle around the altar and join hands. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. As the clock struck midnight, Madame Serena began chanting in a language I didn't understand. The wind picked up, swirling around us, and the temperature dropped sharply. Suddenly, the clearing was filled with the same shadows we had seen in the cabin, dark, twisting figures that seemed to pulse with malevolence. My grandparents appeared at the edge of the circle, their red eyes glowing with fury. They tried to breach the circle, but the herbs and crystals held them back. They screamed in rage, their voices blending into a cacophony of horror that made my blood run cold. Madame Serena's chanting grew louder, more forceful. She took a ceremonial knife and made a small cut on each of our palms, letting the blood drip onto the altar. The shadows recoiled at the sight of the blood, and the figures of my grandparents writhed in agony. But then, something went wrong. One of the candles was extinguished by the wind, breaking the circle's integrity. The shadows surged forward, and my grandparents lunged at us, their twisted faces contorted with rage. Emily screamed as one of them grabbed her, dragging her toward the edge of the clearing. In a moment of sheer panic, I grabbed the crucifix and ran after them. I swung it wildly, shouting my grandparents' names, demanding they let her go. The crucifix glowed with a bright, blinding light, and my grandparents screamed in pain. They released Emily, and I pulled her back into the circle. Madame Serena quickly relit the candle and continued chanting, her voice shaking with fear. The shadows seemed to weaken, their forms growing less distinct. The figures of my grandparents began to fade, their screams growing fainter. With one final desperate cry, they vanished into the night. The wind died down, and the clearing was silent. We stood there, breathless and trembling, hardly daring to believe it was over. Madame Serena collapsed, exhausted but alive. We helped her up, and she gave us a weak smile. "It's done," she said. "They're gone." We made our way back to the house, feeling a cautious sense of relief. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by an almost eerie calm. For the first time in days, we felt like we could breathe. But as we settled back into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, but the fear remained. We all slept in the living room that night, too afraid to be alone. The next morning, we decided to leave the house for good. We packed up our things and made arrangements to stay with family and friends until we could figure out a permanent solution. As we were leaving, I glanced back at the house and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the window of what used to be my grandparents' bedroom, I saw their faces, twisted, grotesque, and filled with rage. They stared at me, and I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We drove away, and I've been staying with Emily's parents ever since. We're looking for a new place, far away from here, but I don't know if that will be enough. I don't know if we'll ever truly be safe. If you're reading this, please take my advice. Never mess with things you don't understand. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And some spirits, once invited in, will never leave. I'll update you if anything changes, but for now, all I can do is hope and pray that we can find a way to escape this nightmare. Stay safe, everyone, and please, if you have any advice, let me know. We're running out of time. Alright, so I never really believed in the whole Ouija board thing. I mean, it's just a piece of wood, right? My name's Mike, and I've always been the skeptic in my group. Anyway, last Friday, my friends and I were hanging out at Jess's place. We were bored out of our minds, and that's when Tyler suggested we try out this old Ouija board he found in his grandma's attic. Now, I should probably mention that Tyler's grandma is known for being a bit eccentric. She's one of those old ladies with a million cats and enough weird trinkets to start a museum. But Tyler swore up and down that the board was legit, like ancient legit. He said his grandma used to mess around with it back in the day, and that just added to the whole mysterious vibe. So there we were, a bunch of 20-somethings acting like teenagers again. There was me, Jess, Tyler, and Sarah. We were sitting in Jess's living room, lights dimmed, candles flickering, the whole 9 yards. Tyler set the board on the coffee table, and we all gathered around it. Honestly, I was just waiting for the moment when one of them would start moving the planchette and try to scare the rest of us. We placed our fingers on the planchette, and Tyler started with the usual Ouija board spiel. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked in this over-the-top spooky voice. We waited, and at first, nothing happened. I smirked, about to call it quits, when the planchette started to move. I immediately looked at Jess, convinced she was messing with us. But her face was pale, and she looked just as freaked out as the rest of us. The planchette spelled out yes. Okay, I thought, cool trick. But then Tyler asked, "Who are you?" And the planchette started moving again. It spelled Malachi. We all exchanged nervous glances. "Malachi? Like the Bible name?" Sarah asked. Tyler shrugged, looking a bit too intrigued for my liking. He continued with the questions, and things started getting really weird. The board claimed this Malachi character was some sort of ancient entity, trapped between worlds. Yeah, right. I was ready to call BS on the whole thing, when the temperature in the room dropped. I mean, it felt like someone had opened a freezer door. Jess's cat, Whiskers, who usually never shut up, started hissing and bolted out of the room. That's when I started getting genuinely freaked out. Tyler, being the idiot he is, asked, "What do you want from us?" The planchette moved so fast it was almost a blur. It spelled out souls. My heart skipped a beat. This was getting way too intense for a Friday night hangout. I wanted to stop, but it was like we were in some kind of trance. Then, the planchette moved to the center of the board and stopped. The candles flickered violently, and Jess's front door slammed shut, even though no one was near it. I swear I heard a low growl coming from the kitchen, but no one else seemed to notice. My mind was racing. I felt this heavy pressure on my chest, like something was sitting on it. Tyler's face had this twisted grin, and his eyes looked different, darker. Suddenly, Jess screamed. She was staring at the board, which now had a pool of blood forming in the middle. We all yanked our fingers away, but the planchette kept moving on its own. It spelled out, "You are mine." That was it. I was done. I stood up, knocking over my chair, and backed away. "This isn't funny anymore, Tyler," I yelled. But he just sat there, staring at the board like he was in a daze. Sarah was crying, Jess was hyperventilating, and I was just about ready to punch Tyler in the face to snap him out of it. Out of nowhere, Tyler started laughing, not his usual laugh, but this deep, guttural sound that didn't even sound human. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed on the floor, convulsing. Jess called 911, but the call wouldn't go through. It was like we were completely cut off from the outside world. And then, just as suddenly as it started, Tyler stopped moving. He sat up, looked around, and asked, "What happened?" Like he didn't remember a damn thing. But I knew something had changed. There was this darkness in his eyes that wasn't there before. We decided to burn the board, thinking it would end whatever freaky shit we had unleashed. We took it out to Jess's backyard, doused it in lighter fluid, and set it on fire. As the flames consumed the wood, we heard this awful, high-pitched scream. It was the most bone-chilling sound I've ever heard, and it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. After that night, things only got worse. Tyler started acting more and more bizarre. He'd disappear for hours, only to come back with no memory of where he'd been. Jess's house became a hotspot for all sorts of paranormal activity. Objects moving on their own, whispers in the middle of the night, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. And the worst part, we all started having the same nightmare, every single night. In the dream, we were trapped in this dark, endless void. Malachi was there, watching us with those soulless eyes, whispering that we belonged to him now. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a jackhammer. I tried everything to get rid of this curse. Priests, psychics, you name it. Nothing worked. I don't know what we unleashed that night, but it's real, and it's not going away. If you ever come across a Ouija board, do yourself a favor and burn it before you even think about using it. I made a mistake, and now we're all paying the price. I wish I could say things got better after we burned the board, but that would be a lie. A big, fat lie. If anything, burning it seemed to piss off whatever we had contacted. The nightmares got worse, and it felt like Malachi was seeping into our reality more and more each day. It started with little things. Tyler would show up at work with scratches on his arms and no idea how he got them. Jess's cat, Whiskers, started acting like it was constantly terrified, hiding in places I didn't even know a cat could fit. Sarah's car wouldn't start half the time, and when she did manage to get it going, the radio would play nothing but static, even on stations that usually worked fine. Then, one night, I woke up to find Tyler standing at the foot of my bed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. He was just standing there, staring at me with that same dark look in his eyes. "Tyler, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted. He didn't respond, just kept staring, and then he turned and walked out of my room. I followed him into the living room, where he collapsed onto the couch and fell asleep, like nothing had happened. The next morning, he didn't remember a thing. He just brushed it off, said he must have been sleepwalking. But I knew better. It wasn't him. It was Malachi, using him like a puppet. That was when I decided we needed help. Real help. I did some research and found a guy who claimed to be an expert in the occult. His name was Vincent, and he ran this creepy little shop downtown. When I walked in, the place smelled like a mix of incense and something rotten. Vincent was this old guy with long, white hair and a beard to match. His eyes were intense, like he'd seen some serious shit. I explained our situation, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You kids have no idea what you've gotten yourselves into," he said. He told me that Malachi wasn't just some spirit, He was a demon, an ancient one, and by using that Ouija board, we had essentially invited him into our lives. "Can we get rid of him?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Vincent shook his head. "Demons like Malachi don't just go away. They need to be banished, and that's a dangerous process." We didn't have a choice. We needed to do something, or we'd end up losing our minds, or worse, our lives. Vincent agreed to help, but he warned us that it wouldn't be easy. He gave us a list of things to gather, candles, herbs, and some other weird stuff, and told us to meet him at Jess's house the next night. That night was the worst yet. We all gathered at Jess's, and I could feel the tension in the air. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Vincent set up the ritual in the living room, drawing strange symbols on the floor with chalk. The whole place reeked of sage and something metallic, like blood. We formed a circle around the symbols, holding hands. Vincent started chanting in a language I didn't recognize. As he chanted, the temperature dropped again, and the candles flickered wildly. I could feel this oppressive weight bearing down on us, like we were being watched by something malevolent. Tyler started to convulse, his eyes rolling back in his head. Vincent continued chanting, louder now, his voice echoing off the walls. Jess was crying, and Sarah was muttering prayers under her breath. I was barely holding it together, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Suddenly, Tyler let out a blood-curdling scream. His body went rigid, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You cannot banish me," he snarled in a voice that wasn't his. "You are mine." Vincent threw a handful of some powder into the air, and it exploded into a blinding flash of light. Tyler collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The candles blew out, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, there was silence, and then we heard it. A deep, guttural laugh coming from all around us. Vincent lit a candle, his face pale and drawn. "It's not over," he said, his voice trembling. "Malachi is still here." We were exhausted, terrified, and defeated. Tyler woke up, dazed and confused, with no memory of what had happened. Vincent told us that the banishment ritual had failed. Malachi was too strong, too entrenched in our lives. He gave us one last piece of advice. Stay together. Do not let him isolate you. Strength is in unity. We tried to follow his advice, but it wasn't easy. Tyler was getting worse, disappearing for longer periods and coming back with no memory of where he'd been. Jess's house felt like a prison, haunted by shadows and whispers. Sarah was a nervous wreck, jumping at every little sound. One night, I woke up to find Jess standing at the foot of my bed, just like Tyler had. Her eyes were empty, void of any emotion. "Mike," she whispered, "it's too late. He's already taken us." I screamed, but no sound came out. I felt a cold hand wrap around my throat, squeezing until I thought I'd pass out. When I woke up, it was morning, and Jess was gone. Her parents called the police, but there was no trace of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. That was the breaking point. We couldn't stay there anymore. We packed our things and left. But no matter where we went, Malachi followed. He was always there, lurking in the shadows, reminding us that we were his. I don't know how this will end, but I do know one thing. We're not getting out of this alive. Malachi owns us, and he's not letting go. After Jess disappeared, things spiraled out of control faster than we could keep up. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over, turning into a full-blown panic. We all knew deep down that she wasn't coming back. Malachi had taken her, and it was only a matter of time before he came for the rest of us. We decided to stick together, just like Vincent had advised. We moved into a small apartment, the four of us crammed into a space meant for two. It was better than staying at Jess's haunted house, but not by much. The shadows seemed to follow us, and we could still hear the whispers at night. Tyler was the worst off. He'd wake up screaming, his body covered in fresh scratches, his eyes wide with terror. Sarah and I took turns staying awake, keeping an eye on him, but it didn't help. Malachi's grip on him was too strong. One night, Sarah and I were sitting in the living room, trying to stay awake. Tyler was in his room, locked in for his own safety. We had started locking him in at night after we found him standing on the edge of the roof, teetering like he was about to jump. He claimed he didn't remember how he got there, but we knew better. "Do you think there's any way to get out of this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were hollow, dark circles etched beneath them. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, which was probably true. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we have to try. For Jess." Sarah nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We were fighting a losing battle, and we both knew it. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from Tyler's room. We bolted to our feet and ran to the door. It was still locked from the outside, but we could hear Tyler screaming, "Let me out! Please, let me out!" I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. When I finally got the door open, Tyler was thrashing on the floor, his eyes rolling back in his head. His body was covered in scratches and bruises, and there was a deep, bloody gash on his arm. "Tyler!" Sarah cried, rushing to his side. I grabbed a towel and pressed it to his arm, trying to stop the bleeding. Tyler's screams turned into sobs, and then he went limp. "We need to get him to a hospital," I said, panic rising in my chest. But Sarah shook her head. "No hospital can help him," she said, her voice breaking. "This is Malachi. He's doing this." I knew she was right. Taking Tyler to a hospital wouldn't fix anything. We needed to find a way to get rid of Malachi once and for all. But how? Vincent had tried and failed, and he was supposed to be an expert. Desperation drove me to do something I never thought I'd do. I decided to contact Malachi directly. I figured if we could communicate with him, maybe we could find a way to negotiate or at least understand what he wanted. I found an old mirror in the attic of our apartment building. It was covered in dust and grime, but it had a certain aura about it that felt right. I brought it down to our living room and set it up, lighting candles around it. Sarah watched me, her face pale and drawn. "This is a bad idea," she said, but she didn't try to stop me. "I know," I replied, taking a deep breath, "but we're out of options." I stared into the mirror, my reflection flickering in the candlelight. "Malachi," I said, my voice trembling, "we need to talk." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air in the room grew cold, and the candles flickered violently. My reflection in the mirror started to warp and twist, turning into something grotesque and unrecognizable. Malachi's face stared back at me, his eyes dark and soulless. "You dare summon me!" he hissed, his voice echoing in my mind. "We need to know what you want," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why are you doing this to us?" Malachi's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You invited me," he said. "You played with the board, and now you belong to me. Your souls are mine. There has to be a way out," I pleaded. "Something we can do to make you leave us alone." Malachi laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "There is no escape," he said. "You are mine forever." I felt a surge of anger. "We won't let you win," I said through gritted teeth. "We'll find a way to stop you." Malachi's eyes flashed with rage. "You can try," he snarled, "but you will fail. And when you do, I will enjoy watching you suffer." The mirror shattered, pieces of glass flying in all directions. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah was crying, her body shaking with sobs. Tyler was still unconscious, his breathing shallow. I felt a sense of hopelessness wash over me. Malachi was right. We couldn't stop him. We were trapped in his web, and there was no way out. But I couldn't give up. I couldn't let Malachi win. There had to be something we could do, some way to fight back. I just had to figure out what it was before it was too late. The days following my attempt to contact Malachi directly were the darkest yet. Tyler was barely hanging on, slipping in and out of consciousness, his body covered in mysterious wounds that seemed to multiply overnight. Sarah was a wreck, her nerves frayed to the point of breaking. And me? I was consumed by a relentless fear that gnawed at my sanity, a constant reminder that we were living on borrowed time. One night, after Tyler had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, Sarah and I sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator. We were both too exhausted to speak, but I could see the question in her eyes. What do we do now? Desperation led me back to Vincent's shop. I had to believe there was something, anything, that could help us. When I walked in, Vincent looked worse than before, like he hadn't slept since the last time I saw him. "I need your help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Malachi's getting stronger. We're running out of time." Vincent sighed, rubbing his temples. "I told you, this isn't a simple matter. Malachi is ancient, powerful, but..." He trailed off, a look of reluctant determination crossing his face. "There might be one last thing we can try." He pulled out an old leather-bound book from a dusty shelf. The cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. "This is a grimoire," he explained. "It contains rituals and spells from centuries ago. There's one ritual that might work, but it's dangerous, more dangerous than anything we've done so far." I nodded, ready to do whatever it took. "What do we need?" Vincent listed the items: black candles, salt, a personal belonging from each of us, and something that belonged to Malachi. The first three were easy enough to get, but the last one seemed impossible. How could we possibly find something that belonged to a demon? Vincent thought for a moment. "The Ouija board," he said. "It was the conduit. If there's anything left of it, it might work." I felt a glimmer of hope. The board was gone, but the ashes remained. We had kept them, a morbid reminder of the night everything changed. I rushed back to the apartment and gathered everything we needed, carefully placing the jar of ashes in my backpack. That night, we returned to Jess's house. It felt like walking into a tomb. The air was thick with a malevolent energy, the shadows deeper and darker than before. We set up in the living room, arranging the candles in a circle and sprinkling salt around us. Vincent began the ritual, chanting in that same strange language, the grimoire open in front of him. We each placed a personal belonging in the center of the circle: a locket from Sarah, a wristband from Tyler, and a photo of me with my family. Finally, I poured the ashes from the Ouija board into a small dish. The room grew colder, the shadows pressing in on us. As Vincent's chanting grew louder, the candles flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls. Suddenly, Tyler began to convulse again, his eyes rolling back. "He's here!" he gasped, his voice strained. "Malachi is here!" The air around us crackled with energy, and I could feel a presence, dark and oppressive. Vincent continued chanting, his voice rising above the growing din. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing, reaching out towards us. Tyler let out a blood-curdling scream, his body arching off the floor. Sarah clutched my hand, her knuckles white with fear. "We have to finish the ritual," Vincent shouted. "Hold him down." I grabbed Tyler's shoulders, pinning him to the floor as Vincent chanted faster and louder. The candles flared, their flames turning a sickly green. The air was filled with the stench of sulfur, and I could hear Malachi's laughter, deep and echoing. "Begone, foul spirit!" Vincent shouted, throwing a handful of salt into the air. "I command you to leave." There was a blinding flash of light, and the room shook violently. Tyler's body went limp, and the oppressive presence seemed to dissipate, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment I thought it had worked, but then Tyler's eyes snapped open, and he looked at me with a mixture of fear and rage. "You think you can banish me?" Malachi's voice snarled through Tyler's lips. "You are mine!" The room plunged into darkness, the candles snuffed out as if by an invisible hand. I could feel Malachi's cold grip around my throat, choking the life out of me. Sarah screamed, but her voice was cut off abruptly. I struggled to breathe, to fight back, but my strength was fading. Vincent's voice cut through the darkness, a final, desperate chant. The pressure around my throat released, and I gasped for air. The darkness lifted, and I saw Vincent slumped over, his body motionless. Tyler was unconscious again, but breathing. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We got rid of him," but as I looked around the room, I knew it wasn't over. Vincent had sacrificed himself to save us, but Malachi was still there, lurking in the shadows. We had bought ourselves time, but at a terrible cost, and I had a feeling that the worst was yet to come. The silence in Jess's living room was suffocating. Vincent lay still, his eyes wide open, but lifeless. His sacrifice had bought us a reprieve, but I could feel Malachi's presence lingering, watching, waiting. We couldn't stay here. We had to leave, but I didn't know where we could go that Malachi wouldn't follow. Tyler started to stir, groaning as he sat up. "What happened?" he asked, rubbing his head. His eyes were his own again, but I could see the haunted look in them. "Vincent saved us," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, "but Malachi is still out there." We gathered our things quickly, not wanting to spend another minute in that cursed house. The sun was beginning to rise as we piled into Sarah's car, the light casting long shadows across the street. I took one last look at Jess's house, feeling a pang of guilt for leaving Vincent behind. But we had no choice. We had to keep moving. We drove aimlessly for hours, not really knowing where to go. Tyler was in and out of sleep, and Sarah was gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. I tried to think of a plan, but my mind was a jumble of fear and exhaustion. Eventually, we found ourselves at a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was somewhere to rest and regroup. We checked in, avoiding the curious gaze of the clerk, and collapsed onto the beds in our tiny room. "We can't keep running forever," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We need to figure out how to stop him for good." "I know," I replied, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "But we need help. Vincent's gone, and we don't know anyone else who can do what he did." Tyler sat up, wincing as he moved. "There's got to be something in Vincent's shop," he said. "Books, notes, anything that can help us figure out how to finish this." It was a risky plan, but it was all we had. We waited until nightfall, then made our way back to Vincent's shop. The streets were eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shop was dark and cold, the scent of incense still lingering in the air. We found the grimoire on the floor where Vincent had left it, but there were other books and papers scattered around, remnants of his life's work. We started sifting through them, looking for anything that might help us. It was Sarah who found it, a small, handwritten journal tucked away on a dusty shelf. Inside were notes on various rituals and spells, along with Vincent's personal thoughts. One entry caught our attention immediately. "Malachi is powerful, but he has a weakness. He feeds on fear and despair. If one can face him without fear, his power diminishes. The key is to confront him in his realm, to force him into a position of weakness." It was a long shot, but it was something. We spent the next few hours preparing, gathering supplies and studying Vincent's notes. We had to confront Malachi in his realm, a place between worlds where he drew his power. We returned to Jess's house, the site of our initial mistake. The air was thick with anticipation as we set up for the ritual in the living room. Using what we had learned from Vincent's journal, we formed a circle, lit the black candles, and began the chant. The air grew cold, and the shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque shapes. I could feel Malachi's presence, a dark force pressing down on us. But this time, we were ready. We held hands, our voices steady as we continued the chant. The room began to spin, and I felt a pulling sensation, like being sucked into a vortex. When the spinning stopped, we were no longer in the living room. We were in a dark, barren landscape, the ground cracked and dry. The sky above was a swirling mass of black clouds, and the air was filled with a low, ominous hum. Malachi appeared before us, his form shifting and changing, a nightmarish figure of shadows and teeth. "You dare challenge me here?" he snarled, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We're not afraid of you," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "You have no power over us." Malachi laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "We'll see about that." He lunged at us, but we stood our ground, repeating the chant, focusing on our fearlessness. The shadows around Malachi flickered, and he recoiled, hissing in anger. The ground beneath us trembled, but we didn't waver. "Your time is over," Sarah said, her voice strong and defiant. "You have no hold on us." Malachi's form began to waver, his power diminishing with each passing second. We pressed on, our voices rising above the noise. The shadows retreated, and Malachi let out a furious roar, his body dissolving into the darkness. Suddenly, we were back in the living room, the candles flickering gently. The oppressive presence was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. We had done it. We had faced Malachi and won. The aftermath was a blur of relief and exhaustion. Tyler, Sarah, and I sat in silence, processing what had happened. We knew the battle was over, but the scars would remain. We had faced a darkness that few could understand, and it had changed us forever. We never spoke of it again. We went our separate ways, trying to rebuild our lives, always carrying the memory of that night. Malachi was gone, but the fear lingered, a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. If you ever find yourself tempted to play with a Ouija board, remember our story. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some nightmares are all too real. Hey everyone, I don't usually post here, but I need to get this off my chest. It's been haunting me, and I'm not sure what to do anymore. So, here it goes. It started a few weeks ago. I work late shifts at a 24/7 diner, and by the time I finish, the streets are empty, and the silence is eerie. It was a typical night, or so I thought. I clocked out around 2 a.m. and began my usual route home. It's about a 20-minute walk through some dimly lit streets, but I've always felt relatively safe. That night, something felt off from the start. I had this uneasy feeling in my gut, like someone was watching me. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination running wild. I put my headphones in and turned up the music, trying to drown out my paranoia, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. About 10 minutes into my walk, I noticed a figure in the distance. At first, I couldn't make out any details, just a shadowy silhouette standing under a flickering streetlight. My heart started pounding, and I felt a chill run down my spine. As I got closer, I could see it was a man, just standing there, staring at me. I tried to avoid eye contact and walked faster, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my head, like someone had hit me with a baseball bat. Everything went black. When I came to, I had no idea how long I had been out. My head was throbbing, and I felt nauseous. I tried to get up, but my body felt heavy and unresponsive. The first thing I noticed was the cold, hard surface beneath me. It wasn't the pavement of the street. It felt like concrete or stone. I opened my eyes and saw that I was in a dark room, lit only by the flickering flame of a single candle. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. There were strange symbols and markings all over the walls, and in the center of the room, there was an old wooden table with a Ouija board on it. Around the table sat 3 people, hooded and silent. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt dry, and my body was still paralyzed. One of the hooded figures looked up and saw that I was awake. They stood up and walked over to me, their face hidden in the shadows of their hood. "Welcome," they said in a raspy voice. "We've been waiting for you." My mind raced with questions. Who were these people? What did they want with me? The figure reached into their robe and pulled out a small vial of dark liquid. They uncorked it and forced it down my throat. The liquid burned as it went down, and I felt a strange sensation spreading through my body. The figure returned to the table and began to chant in a language I didn't understand. The other 2 joined in, their voices low and menacing. The candle flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I struggled to breathe. Suddenly, the planchette on the Ouija board started to move on its own. The hooded figures didn't touch it. It seemed to have a life of its own. My eyes were glued to it, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The planchette spelled out words slowly, one letter at a time. HELPME. My heart skipped a beat. Who was asking for help? Was it a spirit? Or was it someone else trapped in this nightmare? The hooded figures didn't seem surprised or concerned. They continued their chant, their voices growing louder and more intense. The planchette moved again. YOUCANNOTESCAPE. A wave of terror washed over me. I knew I had to get out of there, but my body still wouldn't cooperate. I felt a strange pressure building inside me, like something was trying to take control. My vision blurred and I heard a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The figure closest to me stopped chanting and approached me again. They reached out and touched my forehead, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my body. My vision cleared, and I could move again, but it felt like I was in a dream, my movements slow and sluggish. "Join us," the figure whispered. "Accept your fate." I shook my head, trying to resist, but the pressure inside me grew stronger. The other two figures stood up and surrounded me, their chants merging into a single haunting melody. I felt my will slipping away, my mind being pulled into darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the door to the room burst open. A blinding light filled the space and I heard someone shouting. The hooded figures recoiled, their chants breaking off. I felt hands grab me and pull me out of the room, away from the darkness and the chanting. I blinked and found myself outside, the cool night air hitting my face. The person who had saved me was a complete stranger, but I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They didn't say a word, just led me away from that place, away from the nightmare. I never saw the hooded figures again, but the memory of that night haunts me. I still don't know what they wanted or why they chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting for another chance to finish what they started. I've spent the last few days trying to piece together what happened that night. The police weren't much help. They said it was probably just a group of kids playing a prank. A prank? Seriously? I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something much darker. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but everything felt off. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by nightmares of hooded figures and chanting. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. I didn't feel safe anywhere, not even in my own home. One night, I decided to take a different route home from work, hoping to avoid any reminders of that night. I took a longer path through the park, thinking it would be peaceful. But as soon as I stepped into the park, I felt that same uneasy feeling in my gut. The park was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my feet. The path was dimly lit by old flickering lampposts casting long, twisted shadows. I walked faster, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. About halfway through the park, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the path, was a small, crudely made shrine. It was made of sticks and stones, with strange symbols carved into the wood. In the center of the shrine was a small, old-fashioned doll, its eyes black and lifeless. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't want to get closer, but something compelled me to. As I approached, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under the doll. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and picked up the paper, my hands trembling. The paper was yellowed and brittle, with more of those strange symbols scrawled across it. But at the bottom, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "We know who you are." I dropped the paper and stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, expecting to see the hooded figures lurking in the shadows, but there was no one there. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was out of the park and back on the street. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything. I knew it wouldn't keep them out if they really wanted to get to me, but it made me feel a little safer. I sat on the couch, trying to calm down, but my mind was racing. I decided to do some research. I needed to know what those symbols meant, who those people were, and why they were after me. I spent hours online, diving into forums and obscure websites, looking for anything that matched what I had seen. What I found was terrifying. The symbols were part of an ancient language, used in rituals to summon and control spirits. The hooded figures were likely part of a cult that believed in using these rituals to gain power and influence. They targeted people who they thought had a connection to the spirit world, using them in their dark experiments. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why me? I had never dabbled in the occult, never even touched a Ouija board until that night. But the more I read, the more I realized that it didn't matter. Once they had their sights set on you, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Going to the police again was useless, and I couldn't just sit around waiting for them to come for me. I needed help. Someone who knew more about this stuff than I did. I remembered a guy I used to work with at the diner. He was always into weird, creepy stuff, talking about haunted places and supernatural occurrences. I'd always thought he was a bit of a nut, but now he seemed like my best shot. I gave him a call, and thankfully, he answered. I didn't go into too much detail over the phone, just told him I needed his help with something urgent. He agreed to meet me at a coffee shop the next day. When we met, I told him everything. His face went pale as I described the hooded figures, the Ouija board, the shrine in the park. When I showed him the symbols, he looked genuinely scared. "This is serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're dealing with some dark shit. These people, they're dangerous. They won't stop until they get what they want." "What do I do?" I asked, feeling more hopeless than ever. "There are ways to protect yourself," he said, "but it's risky. You have to fight fire with fire." He went on to explain that I needed to perform a counter-ritual, something that would break their hold on me and send whatever spirits they had summoned back where they came from. He gave me a list of supplies and detailed instructions on what to do. That night, I gathered everything I needed and set up in my living room. I was terrified, but I knew I had to do this. I drew the symbols, lit the candles, and started the ritual. The air felt thick with tension, and I could feel a presence watching me. As I chanted the words he had given me, the room grew colder. The flames of the candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was trying to push me down. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash. The front door flew open, and there they were, the hooded figures. They moved towards me, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. I kept chanting, my voice growing louder and more desperate. One of them lunged at me, but as soon as they touched the circle I had drawn, they recoiled, screaming in agony. The others hesitated, but I could see the anger and determination in their eyes. They weren't going to give up easily. I pushed through the fear, finishing the ritual with a final powerful chant. The room exploded with light, and I felt a surge of energy. The hooded figures screamed and vanished, leaving behind only a cold, empty silence. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. It was over, at least for now. But I knew they would be back. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and I had no idea how to stop them. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their glowing eyes, felt their cold presence. I knew I had managed to fend them off for now, but it felt like a temporary reprieve. I was a marked man, and I needed a more permanent solution. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face going outside, not yet. I spent the entire day researching, looking for anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with. The more I read, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. One name kept popping up in my search. Dr. Jonas Lyle, an expert in the occult and paranormal activities. He had written several books on dark rituals and ancient cults. If anyone could help me, it would be him. I found his contact information and decided to reach out, praying he would respond. To my surprise, he replied within an hour. He sounded intrigued by my story and agreed to meet me the following day at his office. Desperation drove me to pack a bag and drive to his town, a small place about 2 hours away. Dr. Lyle's office was in an old, decrepit building that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The creaky wooden floors and dim lighting did nothing to calm my nerves. I knocked on his door, and a few moments later, a tall, thin man with grey hair and piercing blue eyes opened it. "Mr. Adams, I presume?" he said, extending a hand. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but cold. "Please, come in," he said, gesturing to a chair. The room was cluttered with books and strange artifacts, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I sat down, and he took a seat opposite me, his eyes never leaving mine. "Tell me everything," he said, leaning forward. I recounted the events of the past few days, sparing no detail. His expression remained serious, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "You're dealing with a very old and dangerous cult," he said. "They're known as the Order of the Black Dawn. They believe in harnessing the power of spirits to gain control and influence. They target individuals they believe have a natural connection to the spirit world." "But I don't," I protested. "I've never had any experiences like this before." "Perhaps not consciously," he said, "but something about you attracted their attention. They won't stop until they've used you for their own purposes." I felt a lump in my throat. "So what do I do? How do I stop them?" "There are ways to protect yourself," he said, "but it's not going to be easy. You'll need to perform a series of rituals to sever their connection to you and ward them off permanently." He handed me a list of items and detailed instructions for the rituals. It was a daunting task, but I was determined to do whatever it took to get my life back. I spent the next few days gathering the supplies and preparing myself mentally and physically for what lay ahead. I followed Dr. Lyle's instructions to the letter, performing the first ritual in my small apartment. It was a nerve-wracking experience, but I felt a sense of empowerment as I completed each step. On the fourth night, as I was setting up for the final and most important ritual, I heard a knock on my door. My heart raced as I looked through the peephole. It was my friend from the diner, the one who had helped me with the initial counter-ritual. I opened the door, relieved to see a familiar face. "Hey man," he said, his voice trembling. "I've been worried about you. I had this weird feeling that something was wrong." I nodded, letting him in. "Yeah, it's been a rough few days. I'm about to perform the last ritual to break their hold on me." "I'm glad you're doing this," he said. "But I have to tell you something. I did some digging of my own, and I found out that this cult has been around for centuries. They've done horrible things to people who tried to escape them." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "Like what?" He looked me in the eye, his face pale. "People who tried to fight back ended up worse than before. Some went mad, others disappeared without a trace. They have a way of getting to you, no matter what." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. "But I have to try, right? I can't just give up." He nodded slowly. "Just be careful. Don't let your guard down for a second." With his help, I began the final ritual. The air in the room grew heavy, and the temperature dropped. We chanted together, our voices blending in an eerie harmony. The candles flickered wildly, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. As we reached the climax of the ritual, a loud bang echoed through the apartment. The front door flew open, and the hooded figures stormed in, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. My friend and I continued chanting, but I could feel the fear creeping in. One of the figures lunged at my friend, knocking him to the ground. I screamed and tried to help him, but another figure grabbed me, its grip like iron. I struggled, but it was no use. Their strength was inhuman. "Finish the ritual," my friend shouted, his voice filled with pain. I fought through the terror, reciting the final words of the ritual. The room filled with a blinding light, and I felt a surge of energy. The hooded figures screamed in agony, their forms flickering like shadows in a storm. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. I rushed to my friend's side, helping him up. He was battered and bruised, but alive. "Did it work?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded weakly. "I think so, but we need to be sure." We spent the next few hours cleaning up and double-checking every step of the ritual. By the time we were done, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm glow through the windows. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. But as we sat in the quiet aftermath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The Order of the Black Dawn had been relentless, and I knew they wouldn't give up easily. I had taken a step towards reclaiming my life, but the fight was far from finished. I looked at my friend, his face a mirror of my own exhaustion and determination. We had survived another night, but the darkness was still out there, lurking, waiting for its next opportunity. And I knew I had to be ready. The days following the final ritual were a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. My friend and I took turns staying awake, keeping watch for any signs of the Order of the Black Dawn. The sense of dread never fully lifted. and I could tell he felt it too. We were on high alert, knowing that any lapse in vigilance could be disastrous. On the third day, we received a chilling reminder that our ordeal was far from over. My friend was out grabbing supplies when the phone rang. I picked it up, and a distorted voice spoke on the other end. "You can't escape us, Mr. Adams. We are always watching." I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. I knew better than to believe they had given up, but hearing their voice sent a jolt of terror through me. I needed to find a way to end this for good, to ensure they couldn't come after me again. When my friend returned, I told him about the call. He looked pale, but resolute. "We need to find their headquarters," he said. "We need to confront them directly." The thought of facing the order head-on was terrifying, but he was right. We couldn't keep running and hiding. We had to strike back. Using the information Dr. Lyle had given us, we started piecing together clues that might lead us to their location. It took a few days, but we finally found a lead. There was an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, a place that had a reputation for being haunted. Locals avoided it, claiming to hear strange noises and see ghostly figures at night. It seemed like the perfect hiding place for a cult like the Order of the Black Dawn. We prepared ourselves as best we could, arming ourselves with whatever we could find: knives, flashlights, and a few protective charms that Dr. Lyle had provided. That evening, we drove out to the mansion, the sense of dread growing with every mile. The mansion was a towering, decaying structure, its windows boarded up and its doors hanging off their hinges. We parked the car a safe distance away and approached on foot, trying to be as quiet as possible. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was oppressive. We entered through a side door, the hinges creaking loudly. Inside, the mansion was even more unsettling. The air was cold and stale, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, similar to the ones I'd seen during the rituals. It was clear we were in the right place. As we made our way through the dark, twisting hallways, I felt the same eerie presence I had felt during the rituals. We could hear faint whispers and the occasional creak of floorboards, but we saw no one. The atmosphere was suffocating, each step feeling like a descent into madness. We reached a large, heavy door at the end of a long corridor. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. My friend gave me a nod, his expression steely. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was a grand hall, its ceiling high and ornate, though covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room was a large altar, surrounded by more hooded figures. They were chanting, their voices low and menacing, echoing off the walls. The sight of them made my blood run cold. They didn't seem to notice us at first, their focus entirely on the ritual they were performing. I spotted an old weathered book on the altar, its pages glowing with an eerie light. It had to be the source of their power. My friend and I moved quickly, trying to take advantage of their distraction. We crept closer, staying in the shadows, our hearts pounding. Just as we were within reach of the altar, one of the figures turned and saw us. "Intruders!" they shouted, their voice echoing through the hall. The chanting stopped, and all eyes turned to us. The next few moments were a blur of chaos and fear. The hooded figures surged towards us, their hands reaching out with unnatural speed. We fought back, using our knives and the protective charms, but they were relentless. In the chaos, I managed to reach the altar. I grabbed the book, feeling its dark energy pulsing through my veins. The hooded figures screamed in rage, their voices mingling into a deafening cacophony. "Destroy it!" my friend shouted, struggling to fend off the attackers. I opened the book, the pages filled with strange symbols and illustrations of horrific rituals. Without thinking, I began tearing the pages out, throwing them to the ground. The room shook, the walls cracking as the dark energy was released. The hooded figures howled in pain, their forms flickering and distorting. My friend and I continued our assault, tearing the book apart until it was nothing but a pile of shredded paper. The room erupted in a blinding light, and I felt a surge of energy that knocked me off my feet. When the light faded, the hooded figures were gone. The air was still, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I looked around, dazed, and saw my friend lying on the ground, breathing heavily but alive. We had done it. We had destroyed their source of power. But as I helped my friend to his feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The Order of the Black Dawn was ancient and powerful, and I knew they wouldn't give up easily. We left the mansion, the weight of our actions heavy on our shoulders. As we drove back to town, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. We had won a battle, but the war was far from over, and I knew we had to be ready for whatever came next. The days following our raid on the mansion were strangely calm. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. My friend and I took the time to recuperate, patching up our wounds and trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the sense of unease never truly left. One night, about a week after our confrontation, I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I felt a sudden chill. My eyes snapped open, and I saw a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. The figure leaned closer, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You think you can destroy us so easily?" it hissed, its voice sending shivers down my spine. "We are eternal. We will never stop." Before I could react, the figure vanished, leaving me gasping for breath. I sat up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I knew then that our fight was far from over. The next morning, I called my friend. He sounded as shaken as I felt. "We need to go back," I said, my voice firm. "We need to finish this once and for all." He agreed, and we spent the next few days preparing. We gathered more supplies, including more protective charms and weapons, and studied every piece of information we could find on the Order of the Black Dawn. We knew we had to be ready for anything. On the night of the new moon, we made our way back to the mansion. The air was thick with tension, and the darkness seemed even more oppressive than before. We entered through the same side door, moving silently through the decaying hallways. The grand hall was eerily quiet, the altar now a pile of rubble, but we knew better than to let our guard down. We searched the room, looking for any signs of the cult. It was then that we noticed a hidden door behind the altar, partially obscured by the debris. We pried the door open and descended a narrow, winding staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a large, cavernous chamber, lit by the flickering light of torches. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, covered in strange, glowing runes. Hooded figures surrounded the altar, their chanting filling the air with a low, menacing hum. My friend and I exchanged a look of determination and moved forward. As we approached, the chanting stopped, and the figures turned to face us. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their faces were twisted with rage. "You should have stayed away," one of them said, their voice echoing through the chamber. "We're here to end this," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The figures moved towards us, their hands crackling with dark energy. We fought back with everything we had, using our weapons and protective charms. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, the clashing of steel and the crackle of dark magic. In the midst of the chaos, I noticed a large, ancient book on the altar. It was covered in runes, and I knew it had to be their true source of power. I fought my way to the altar, my heart pounding. As I reached the book, one of the figures lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. I struggled to my feet, but they were on me, their hands around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. My vision blurred and I felt myself slipping away. Then, out of nowhere, my friend tackled the figure, knocking them off me. I gasped for breath and grabbed the book, feeling its dark energy pulsing through me. I knew I had to destroy it, but I also knew it wouldn't be easy. With all the strength I could muster, I began tearing the pages out, chanting the words Dr. Lyle had given me. The room shook, the ground cracking beneath our feet. The hooded figures screamed in agony, their forms flickering and distorting. As I ripped out the last page, the chamber was engulfed in a blinding light. The hooded figures vanished, their screams echoing into silence. The ground stopped shaking, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. My friend helped me up, his face pale but determined. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I "I think so," he replied, "but we need to get out of here." We made our way back up the staircase, the mansion eerily silent. As we stepped outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. We drove back to town in silence, the weight of our actions heavy on our shoulders. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal life. The nightmares still haunted me, but they grew less frequent. My friend and I kept in touch, both of us wary but hopeful that we had finally put an end to the Order of the Black Dawn. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The cult may be gone, but the darkness they summoned lingers. I can only hope that we have done enough to keep it at bay. For now, I live with the scars of that night, a constant reminder of the horrors we faced. But I also live with the knowledge that we fought back, that we stood up against the darkness and survived. And in the end, that has to be enough.